Good evening, or afternoon, or morning, depending on where in the world you are. My name is Linda Bell, and it's my honor as Provost to welcome you to the second lecture in Barnard's Big Problems, Making Sense of 2020. This lecture series is a new component of our first year experience program, designed especially for the class of 2024. First year experience introduces our incoming class to the intellectual life of the college in small seminar group settings, equips them with critical reading, discussion, and writing skills that cross disciplinary boundaries and provides them with strong foundations for a successful career. So welcome to our first year students. Over the course of 2020, we've witnessed both the profoundly destructive effects of COVID-19 and the power of collective action. And even as the pandemic revealed the deep-seated inequities inherent in our healthcare system, we were made witness to a simultaneous uprising of voices against systemic and violent racism in our nation. The last 7 months of our lives have been characterized by despair, sorrow, hate, and yet with it all, powerful protests accompanied at discrete and significant moments with an uplifting sense of possibility and hope. This course and its accompanying lecture series were intentionally created to challenge our students and the greater Barnard community to actively and critically engage with this pivotal moment in time and to help us grapple together with the urgent questions that it poses. These questions were created to help guide our thinking in the Big Problems lecture series, and I repeat them for us this evening. What does this moment reveal about existing power structures, value systems, and the institutions that produce and replicate them? What forms of destabilization might we actually welcome as part of a long history of anti-racist feminist activism? How do we care for and center communities who experience the pain and injustices of this moment most directly? And what might our world ideally look like as we move forward? Tonight, we ask our community to join us in continuing to examine 2020 through these multiple significant lenses. Our lecture this evening will be followed by a question and answer session in which our speaker will answer questions that were submitted by our Barnard first year students who've recently read 3 of our speakers' most powerful pieces from the New York Times Magazine. I want to pause to take this opportunity to thank the faculty directors of first year writing and first year seminar who've worked with our students to structure this series. Professor Pam Cobrin, Wendy Schorheim, Laurie Postlewaite, and Cecilia Lee Spahn. I am now extraordinarily pleased to introduce our speaker for this evening, Linda Villarosa. Linda Villarosa is a journalist, author, editor, novelist, and educator. She's a contributing writer to the New York Times Magazine, covering race and public health, and also a former executive editor at Essence Magazine. Her 2018 New York Times Magazine cover story, Why America's Black Mothers and Babies Are in a Life or Death Crisis, was nominated for a National Magazine Award. Her 2017 article, Americans' Hidden HIV Epidemic, won a National Lesbian and Gay Journalists Award for Excellence in Journalism. Her essay, Myths About Physical Racial Differences Were Used to Justify Slavery and Are Still Believed by Doctors Today, was included in the New York Times 1619 project in August 2019. Most recently, she covered the toll that COVID-19 has taken on Black communities in America and examined race, health disparities, and COVID-19 through the lens of the Zulu Social Aid and Pleasure Club of New Orleans in her New York Times Magazine piece, A Terrible Price, The Deadly Racial Disparities of COVID-19 in America. Linda Villarosa is the author or co-author of 3 books, including Body and Soul, The Black Woman's Guide to Physical Health and Emotional Well-Being. Her novel, Passing for Black, was released in 2008 and was nominated for a Lambda Literary Award. Linda is currently writing the book, Under the Skin, Race, Inequality, and the Health of a Nation, which will be published by Doubleday in 2021. Linda Villarosa is a graduate of the University of Colorado, spent a year at the Harvard T.H. Chan School of Public Health as a journalism distinguished fellow, and holds a master's degree in urban journalism and digital storytelling from CUNY's Craig Newmark Graduate School of Journalism. She now teaches reporting, writing, and Black studies at the City College of New York. Linda Villarosa, welcome. It is a true pleasure to have you with us this evening, and we look forward to your remarks.
Hi, Barnard community. Thank you so much for having me here. I wish we were in person. I work, when we're, in real life, I work just up the block from Barnard at City College, and, just really love the community, and am really happy to be here tonight. I'm going to talk about race, health, and inequality, and that's what I cover for the New York Times Magazine. That's what I wrote about at Essence Magazine and edited stories on those topics, and also what I care deeply about, because much of the experience of being Black in America and also being Black in our healthcare system has affected me and my family personally. So I'm going to just introduce the topic and then sort of dig deep and talk about what's going on now, what has happened in the past, and how it reverberates today. So again, thank you. So the United States has the most advanced health technology in the world, or at least the most expensive. Yet we lag behind other countries of matched for wealth, or other so-called developed countries, when it comes to the key measures of health. And those measures of health also reflect the well-being of our nation. It starts at birth and goes all the way through the life cycle. So our infant mortality rate, babies that die related to pregnancy or the year after, is higher than in the other developed countries. And our life expectancy is lower and has been dropping. And we are the only country, a wealthy country, where the number of women who die or almost die in childbirth has been rising over the last few years. So what's bizarre about it is when you look at these outcomes and you're thinking, why is this rich country having so many poor health outcomes? It's treated as a mystery, sort of like, oh, what could be going on in America? But the root causes are actually hiding in plain sight. So if you look at what's going on in the country, these health disparities, I know most about Black health disparities, Black-white, because of my background at Essence. But these are driven by discrimination and inequality, though that is so rarely talked about. It's talked about more now, but hadn't been before. So the health outcomes of African American, Black Americans are so much lower than other Americans, especially white Americans, that if we were our own country, if there was this place called Black America, our health outcomes would look like some of the poorest countries that our ancestors came from. In most cases, in every sort of measure, it's worse. So Black babies are 1.5 times more likely to die or almost die in the first year of life. And that adds up to 4,000 lost babies every year. And in fact, the Black-white gap in infant mortality is wider now than it was in 1850 when Black women were chattel. And all babies died so often that their parents were loath to name them because they were afraid they didn't want to attach. Even with life expectancies, there's been a lot of conversation about the so-called diseases of despair. These are drug overdoses and alcoholism and suicide. And those are affecting more and more white people. But still, as far as life expectancy, Black people live 3.5 years less. And Black men actually have the lowest life expectancy in the country. So also we live sicker and die quicker. That's how I think of it. It's just a simple way to say it. It's like, we just have a lot more sickness and early death in among Black people. So too often, however, this inequality and these health disparities are sort of, I guess, it's said that it's only due to poverty. So it's kind of like, well, it's like, this is a problem of poverty, not race. And I saw this argument. I'm on a listserv with other people in public health, and there was an argument that went on for 2 weeks about this. And it was like, no, this is about race. No, it's about poverty. No, it's about the intersection. And certainly poverty is very important in this discussion. And being Black and poor just makes everything worse. It means your quality of life is worse. It means you have more stress, you have more fear. The community you live in may not be as healthy as far as food, water, air, where you can exercise, safety. But poverty is not really the main cause of these health disparities, or it's not the only cause, and it may not be the main cause. But too often, it's like, if you're poor, you get blamed for being poor. If you're Black and poor, you get blamed for being poor and Black, and there's a lack of sympathy and empathy for you and your health conditions. So, but however, race in itself has to do with this problem, even when poverty is decoupled. And I found this out when I was working on my article about infant maternal mortality. And a friend came to me and she said, we have this problem of maternal mortality in the United States. And I said, oh, well, I'm sure among the very poorest people, that makes sense. And it's horrible. And then she said, no, if you look at the numbers, Black women are still 3 to 4 times more likely to die or almost die in childbirth. And a Black woman with an advanced degree is more likely to die or almost die than a white woman with an 8th grade education. And I was so shocked that I kind of didn't believe her. And so I remember what she did. She looked at me and she said, don't you have an advanced degree? And I thought, oh, something is going on here that is beyond class and is about race in itself. Certainly in that article, I didn't have to argue it very hard, because when I was writing that piece, Serena Williams had a terrible birth outcome. I mean, she has a beautiful, wonderful baby now, but she was ignored by the doctors that were supposed to make this the best day of her life. She's a person who is superhuman in knowing her body. She's a person who has access to tremendous wealth, but she still had a terrible birth of her daughter because her legitimate concerns were ignored. So obviously something else is going on in this country than just the low income levels. So, but how this has been explained in the past, so looking at all these health disparities that are different that I just went through, have been in 2 ways. One is the genetic explanation. So it's that something is wrong, read inferior, about the Black body. And this explanation has been going on since 1619, when the first enslaved Africans came to America. I wrote about that in my essay. And even I was shocked, because I mean, I knew that these stereotypes around the Black body being inferior existed, but what I didn't understand is that they were invented by doctors in science, largely Southern doctors and scientists who had a stake in keeping Black people enslaved. The 2 worst ones were that Black people had extremely high pain tolerance, so that we could withstand any kind of pain, whether it was hard work in the fields, whether it was being whipped, whether it was the emotional pain of having our children taken away from us, or our mates killed. And so this was an idea that was pushed forward by physicians and scientists. It wasn't just, something floating around. And many of them had a stake in keeping slavery alive, because it was supporting, our country, and especially our South. The other one was that Black people had poor lung function, so that that actually working in the fields would build up the lungs. And this myth may have been started by Thomas Jefferson, who was obviously a slave owner and had enslaved children. So that has also lingered to the present, but those are myths. But even recently, I had to argue someone down about some of these myths. And so these still are lingering in both medical education and in the society as a whole, that something is wrong with the Black body, which explains these poor health outcomes. So the second thing to explain the poor health outcomes is that something is wrong with the Black culture, so that there's something wrong with us. We don't understand how to take care of our bodies. We don't care. We're careless. We are uneducated and don't know what we're supposed to be doing as far as eating, as far as exercising, as far as going to the doctor. And so that it's our fault. So against this backdrop of blaming the victim, I guess, and also believing that something was wrong with the Black body, came COVID-19 basically in February. And so as soon as it became, this became a thing, and it was something like, oh, there's this strange new disease, bubbling under the surface in public health circles, or at least the progressive ones, people started saying, on the listservs that I was on the webinars and on these things, that this is going to hit the Black community harder, longer, and worse. We're going to have high death rates. This was before any numbers had come out at all. But because there was this backdrop of health disparities that I went through, whether it was infant mortality, high rates of heart disease, getting diseases earlier, we knew that this was going to happen. But the sad thing was, we also knew that it was going to be this dual thing. It's like, oh, COVID-19 is going to be a problem of the Black body. Something's wrong with Black people, or we're doing something wrong. You're not taking care of yourself, so no wonder you're getting this disease that is deadly. And sure enough, at the beginning of the outbreak, there became early statistics that showed that African-American people were more likely to be hospitalized. And so that was the first thing. And the second was that the death rates were higher. And so even before widespread, the Centers for Disease Control, or the COVID-19, the coronavirus task force released their numbers, there was this hospitalization study. And then there were these death rates showing up in cities where there were a lot of Black people. So it was in New Orleans, it was in Chicago, it was in New York City, it was in Milwaukee, and in, I think, Minneapolis, but it was places where there were a lot of Black people, and especially in those communities. So when those numbers started bubbling up, there became this fear. It's like, oh, it's gonna be this knee-jerk thing where COVID is a problem of Black people who are not taking care of themselves and who have this genetic problem with their bodies. And right away, that happened. If you remember, there was, I think it was the governor of Louisiana, or a Louisiana legislature, that right away said, oh, there's something different about Black bodies that is making these COVID worse. And then I think it was the Surgeon General, who's actually Black, said, his advice was, hey, just take better care of yourself. Don't use drugs, don't drink, keep your family healthy, without any acknowledgement about discrimination in healthcare, about discrimination in society that may be making this worse, about the conditions of Black communities all over the country that may be making COVID worse, or about the way we are working. We're frontline workers. So we are coming in the direct path of COVID. But that happened right away. But what happened shortly after that was much more positive. I mean, in a completely negative situation. And that was that it became clear that many of the people who had been talking about, like me, talking about health inequality, had been talking about health disparities, rose to the surface, and our voices became heard. And we began to say, there is a different explanation than just either a genetic problem, something wrong with our bodies, or something wrong with our culture. And so it became this three-pronged conversation. So I'll take you through sort of the newer thinking about why Black people, at least, babies die more often, women die more often in childbirth, why we are suffering from many of these so-called lifestyle diseases like diabetes and heart disease, and why our life expectancy is lower. So the first one is is that the lived experience of being Black in America actually ages the body. So it's the idea that there's an accelerated aging that comes with dealing with the day-to-day trauma of racism, of discrimination, and of bias. And so this idea is most said in the best way by Arlene Geronimus. She is a professor at the University of Michigan and a brilliant and actually scholar and a wonderful person. So she named her phenomenon weathering because she said it's two-pronged, because she said something about being Black in America, and she did her research first with infant mortality, is making babies small. And certainly Black babies, we know that, have lower birth weight, even across class lines, than white babies and babies of other ethnicities. And that leads to those high rates of infant mortality. But her thing was the body gets weathered when you have to fight the daily day battle against discrimination. And she proved it using a measure called allostatic load. So what she found out was, you know, every day some aggression happens to you, whether it's small, somebody thinks you're not as smart as them, someone follows you in a store, somebody just doesn't trust you when you get in the elevator, something like that. Or you're actually discriminated against in housing, by the police, or at your job. This prematurely weathers the body the way a storm might weather a house, knock the paint off of it, pull the shutters down. But her thing is also has an upside because the Black community is resilient. We weathered that storm. We are like the house that's still standing in a hurricane. But that became the first way to think about COVID. So when all of those underlying conditions that made COVID worse, hospitalizations and death worse, right away, Dr. Geronimus's theory came into the forefront. And she's doing great. I just talked to her. She's got a new book coming out and everything and before she was kind of like considered not as a legitimate scholar, but now her theories make sense because Black people get COVID-19 at younger ages, not get it, but get sick from it and die from it or hospitalized from it. So if you look at a younger age group of Black people look like an older age group of white people. And that's just something that happened. Personally, it's personal for me, not necessarily about COVID, but when I got pregnant with my daughter, I had this really strange ailment called intrauterine growth restriction. So when I went to the doctor, I was the health editor of Essence. So I'm like trying to really look really healthy and be healthy because I'm in the public eye and I'm kind of a health role model. So my baby was small. So when I went to the doctor, I went to Mount Sinai and my doctor said to me, "Are you drinking? Are you using drugs? Are you not taking care of yourself? Like your baby you shouldn't have this strange disease. You shouldn't have this ailment." I had to go to a perinatalogist. They drilled me down. They're like, "Do you use crack?" I was like, "Well, I'm the health editor of Essence. I'm not using crack." My little girl was born at 4 pounds, 13 ounces. So that's considered low birth weight, put her at like, I think 10 times the risk of dying. She's fine now. She's good. She's an athlete. She's taller than me. But I always wondered about that idea of weathering. Did something about my experience of being Black in America lead to me having a tiny baby? So that's the first thing, the idea that just being Black in America affects your health. So the second idea that is coming into the fore is the so-called social determinants of health. And that's a very wonky way to look at where you live matters. So in Black communities, there's often a lack of healthcare facilities. There's often a lack of affordable, healthy food to purchase. So there's not a Whole Foods in every Black community, although my mother's really happy that we have one in Harlem now. They're not safe places to exercise. But the one that strikes the most is the one I wrote about most recently, is about air quality. And so in many of our communities, we don't even have the right to breathe healthy air. And again, it's across class lines. So we live in communities that are 75% more likely to be polluted, to be near a polluting facility. So how that affects COVID is right away, like early on, right after those racial, the statistics were released about COVID and race, where I went to school for a year, Harvard School of Public Health, released a study that said people who breathe bad air, and it was mostly, they were looking at so-called Cancer Alley, one of the most polluted places in the country, which is where a lot of Black people live, obviously. So people that breathe that unhealthy air are more likely to have poor COVID outcomes, need to be hospitalized, need to be on a ventilator, or die. And then you put that with the idea that Black people are 75% more likely to live in communities without healthy air. That is the intersection. For me, that is also personal. My family is originally from Chicago by way of Mississippi, so the Great Migration. And my mother wanted me to take her back to where she grew up in the Englewood section of Chicago. So about 6 months ago, right before COVID, I took her. Her community was devastated. Her high school wasn't there. I said, Mom, where is your high school? This looks like an empty lot in the middle of Chicago. Her elementary school was boarded up. There was nothing there. This was the community that my middle class family from Mississippi came from. 8 miles north is Streeterville. Streeterville is like the wealthiest section of Chicago. People live to age 90. That's the average life expectancy in Streeterville. In my mother's community, it's age 60. We were devastated when we saw that. But that is, and I looked at a map. I explained what redlining was to my mom. I said, Mom, your community was redlined. So that meant in the 30s and 40s, when you were growing up, the government, this is a state sanctioned thing, drew a line around your community where where your aunts and uncles came to Mississippi, where your parents came, and said, this is a place where we need to not invest because something's wrong with it. They called it hazardous. So they drew a line around my mother's community. In New York City, if you look at the communities that are redlined, those are also, almost 100%, the communities that also have the poorest health outcomes. So for me, that too was personal. So the third reason to explain, the sort of newer explanation or more progressive explanation to explain these health disparities, is the idea that there is discrimination in the healthcare system itself. And so that is the one that is kind of the most sad and the most horrible. That also goes back to the years of enslavement when doctors and scientists were mistreating enslaved people. It continued through Jim Crow, and it continues to this day. And sometimes I get into arguments with people and I'm like, it's like playing the dozens. Don't mess with me with this one. So in 2002, there was the gold standard study called Unequal Treatment. And it looked at 483 other studies to show that discrimination in healthcare at every disease, every kind of treatment, every kind of care, Black people simply got poorer healthcare. So the one that struck me the most was the idea of diabetes, when you have to get your feet amputated because you have such terrible diabetes. So this study looked at Black people and white people. Everybody was the same as far as access to healthcare and income and those markers. But Black people were more likely to have their feet amputated than white people, even when everything else was equal. And I just thought, oh my God, how could that be? But that just struck me that something about the healthcare system is so unfair that, you go in and you're going to be more likely for no reason, not no reason, but to have your foot amputated unfairly. This too, for me, is personal. My father got very ill about 20 years ago, and I was living in New York City. I'm from, I grew up most of my years in Denver where my father was living. So my mother called me and she said, your father's really sick. You've got to fly into New York City, fly out of New York City to Denver and come home and see what's going on. So I said, okay. And I didn't have any facts. And she said, get really dressed up and put I was working at the Times, put your New York Times business card in your pocket. So I went I flew in, my mother picked me up at the airport. She's dressed really nice too. And we go to the hospital. My father, who, you know, studied biology in college, was always really well dressed, worked for the federal government for many years, a retired, sold real estate, was in his bed with a dirty gown. His hair was like all crazy, and he was shackled to the bed. So I went to him and I said, "Daddy, what's wrong?" And he just said, "Get me out of here." He was at a veterans hospital, which he had insisted on because he was a war hero. And he said, "That is my right. I got to go to the veterans hospital." So my mother's she knew exactly what to do. We were all dressed up. We were all officious and demanding things. And then we also showed them a picture of him before he got ill. He ended up having colon cancer. So I said, "This is my father when he's dressed up nice." I showed them his college degree. I said, "My father studied biology. If you speak to him in a kind way, he'll understand you and won't be angry." I guess that's why they shackled him. And also I showed them his medals. I said, "He insisted on being here because it's his right to get care from a veterans hospital." So my mother and I pulled the class card because that's all we had. But everyone should not have to go through that and should have fair treatment. So those are the three reasons: the lived experience of being Black in America, the communities that are sometimes devastated and are not as so-called healthy than other communities due to government sanctioned things that happen. And finally, an unfair healthcare system that treats people badly because of race. So the newer thinking is that it is not race that itself that is a risk factor for any kind of disease, whether it's COVID, whether it's heart disease, whether it's infant mortality, whether it's maternal mortality, whether it is a shortened life expectancy. It's not race itself. It's not something about being Black. It's not something about the Black body, but instead race is not a risk factor. It's a risk marker for discrimination, ill treatment, and bias. So this can happen to anyone. It's just happened to Black people since 1619. And we know more about Black bodies because we were commodified. Our bodies have been studied really well because they were worth a lot of money in the beginning. And the studies around racial health disparities and inequality have continued. So I know that is not the most positive way to sort of peel off of this talk. So I'm gonna say something that I am hopeful. So this is, and I'm gonna be really specific. Yesterday, I was on a call with a young medical student who wanted to tell me about her work. So she's at Berkeley. She wants to be a doctor. She wants to either do pediatrics or OBGYN, and she's also studying public health. She took a class from a professor that was kind of like me, telling the whole class about these racial health disparities and explaining it. She got really angry. And she said, "I do not want to be a doctor in this kind of system." So she got some of her classmates together and she started the Institute of Healing and Justice in Medicine. So, I mean, recently, like only several months ago at the beginning of COVID. So they put out a manifesto that is super smart. It sounds like the book I'm writing. It's very well done by these medical students. They just took it upon themselves. So yesterday she and I were on the call and she's really so fired up. And I said, "How did your launch go?" And she said, "It went great. They had, just using social media and word of mouth, they had 800 people on their call, but 7,000 medical students, residents, and doctors and people interested have viewed their manifesto, have viewed their site." So I noticed that their site had a mailing address. So I said, "Okay, what is this mailing address?" She goes, "Okay, we don't have an office or anything. This is just like it's the lounge in our school where we go." And then I said, "Okay, is there really like an institute?" She goes, "Well, this is the institute. It's our site." But she has had so much interest in this from medical students all over the country and interns and residents that it's really turned into a thing. I said, "How much funding do you have?" They got a $750 grant just to bring in speakers and to pay for pizza or something when they meet in person. So I thought, if these medical students can use the mailing address of their lounge, can be running this thing off of $750, I could find that in my couch cushions, And then, but they're really doing something to change medical education and pushing back against some of the things that they're learning because they want to be a different kind of doctor. That's what gives me hope. I'm going to end there, and I'm really excited to take your questions.
Thank you, Linda. That was really a wonderful talk with lots of information. I think we have a lot of questions, so I'm going to get right to those questions. I want to remind everyone, I'm asking the questions of the students. So I'm going to restrain myself to ask my own questions because I feel like I could ask you questions for about a good 45 minutes. So our students read 4 of your pieces, 3 of the New York Times articles, and then they saw some video as well. So their questions are related to those pieces. Why America's Black mothers and babies are in a life or death crisis, myths about physical racial distances that were used to justify slavery, and a terrible price, the deadly racial disparities of COVID-19. And building off of the way you concluded your talk right now, I'll ask this first question, which is, throughout your article, Why America's Black mothers and babies are in a life or death crisis, you cite instances where blame for infant mortality was shifted to Black women. In some sense, your own personal experience narrates that as well. And where they were the ones that were expected to solve the problem, what sort of change do you think it will take on a systemic level to get the medical community to change where they place blame, and I'll add in where they, and the way in which they practice?
I'm a really hopeful person. Nicole Hannah-Jones, who did the 1619 Project, and I always get into an argument because she's not very hopeful, and I'm really hopeful. What gives me hope about the future of that is in California has the same maternal mortality as everyone else. So California really put into place these protocols to sort of solve the maternal mortality problem. And so they created these toolkits so that when a woman is going, in labor and delivery, you can just pull out the toolkits, and all the things you need in case of a C-section or in case of hemorrhaging are right there. And they gave everyone a checklist of these are the things to do. And between, I think it was 2006 and 2013, I'm not sure about those numbers, but the rate of women who died in childbirth dropped by 50%. It was amazing. So everybody's like, oh, look, these clinical technical things work. That's all you need to do. But what didn't change one iota was the racial disparity. So Black women, even though the raw numbers were down, were still 3 to 4 times more likely to die in childbirth. And that was mainly because the white numbers got better. So next year, so they decided, wait, this isn't enough. You can't just doctor your way out of this. You've got to do something that says there is bias in the healthcare system. So it's kind of an experiment, and we'll see what happens next year. But the state of California, by law, and it's a piece of legislation that was championed by some Black women legislators, which is amazing and great. So every healthcare provider who works with a pregnant woman or delivers babies has to go through some kind of implicit bias or anti-racism training, period, or you can't work in the field. So I think that is going to be an experiment. Let's see what happens with the numbers now that, this law is in place starting next year.
That's great. Another question, how do we find the balance between trusting science, because we're in a pandemic, this student asks, but also questioning the motives and the people behind our science and healthcare, since the legitimacy and societal trust in science has been used to justify horrible things, such as slavery, as explained in your piece, myths about physical racial differences. So how do we kind of balance those two, trusting science to give us the answers and understanding the damage that science or scientists or medical community has done up until?
I think the discussion about bias in healthcare and that kind of thing has gotten so much more robust. I mean, I think about it, and I think of Tuskegee. Tuskegee was only, it only ended in 1970, So it's been pretty recent that bad things happen. Certainly, I mean, many of us read about that ICE facility where the detainees were sterilized without them really knowing it. So I think what our job is now is to, just like those medical students that have, you know, they're on a wing and a prayer, they created this institute. I think we need much more progressive thinking and watchdogs and legal people, you know, and sort of lawsuits and things like that. I'm excited by the interest in my work. I'm excited even being here tonight to say there is more of this. We certainly have to trust science, but not totally. You have to question everything. I question every single thing. I am always asking, like, oh, how do I know? How do you know? That's what I do with my students. I read, you know, I really look for the most legitimate studies at the biggest journals. I only use those at the biggest, most sort of legitimate, I hate using that word, journals. But still, you do have to question everything. And I think it's, I'm happy that doctors have also, and other medical providers have started to question themselves. So I think that's a good sign.
Great. Another student writes, I noticed in your article why American Black mothers and babies are in a life or death crisis. There was no mention of legislation or policy change on a federal government level that's been brought forth in addressing this health crisis. So can this issue be addressed through legislation? You've just given an example of some form of legislation. Is there additional examples of that? And how can we create systems that hold doctors accountable for racial malpractice?
Well, there has been some legislation put forward, but nothing has passed yet. So a couple of the things that have happened since that I've been trying to keep track of is sort of all the progressive people, Kamala Harris, Ayanna Pressley, Elizabeth Warren, Cory Booker. These senators have, and Congress people have put forward some legislation around different ways to look at to solve maternal mortality. One of them is anti-bias training. One of them is, I think Elizabeth Warren is sort of a monetizing the hospital. So the hospital gets is rewarded when their rates of maternal C-sections and maternal mortality drop. So I think that all of this is good. And certainly in Louisiana, where my story took place, they have covered doula care. So the doula that Latona Giwa that I was with only made $600 for all that work she did. But now doula care is covered under, you know, they get paid by the government now. I don't think it's perfect, but I think it's better. It will take a lot more to get a, you know, we're going to have a change of administration, you know, before anything big can happen. I mean, right now we're just fighting to keep the Affordable Care Act. Some states still haven't expanded Medicaid coverage. And so, you know, there's a lot of work to be done, but I think when there's a more progressive, open-minded, you know, government at the top and both the House and Senate are different, which I'm hoping for, things will be different.
Another question, what sort of bringing together the infant mortality, the terrible infant mortality statistics, really generally in the US, but also in for sure in the context of racial difference. But what does the issue of infant mortality look like in the context of COVID-19? How has the pandemic exacerbated this issue? Is there a place where your piece, Why America's Black Mothers and Babies Are in a Life or Death Crisis, intersects with your piece, A Terrible Price, the deadly racial disparities of COVID-19?
That's super interesting question that I don't exactly know how to answer. So I'm just going to answer it with a little bit of an anecdote. So both of those pieces took place in, you know, New Orleans. The second one, The Terrible Price, I didn't go back because it was during the COVID time. So I had to report the whole thing over the phone, but, you know, I still managed to get the story. But I'm still friends with some of the doulas. One of my doula friends is now a midwife. And so she has talked to me about, you know, people being turned away from the hospital when they want to give birth. Her business, I mean, you know, she's a racial justice midwife, so her business isn't that lucrative. but she has talked about more women being afraid to go to the hospital. And I'm talking about, you know, the poorest women. And so they're having their babies at home, but also there's a little bit of an army of people down there that it's kind of like an underground railroad kind of thing, where they're helping women to sort of get the care they need. It was this really wonderful story of this woman who, she was miscarrying. And so the hospital turned her away because it was too flooded with COVID patients. And so one of the doulas called a doctor friend that walked her into another hospital so she didn't bleed to death and so that she could miscarry, you know, in a way that she didn't end her life. And then one of the doulas got her back home. They checked on her. So certainly this kind of underground railroad healthcare shouldn't be a thing, but I'm glad it is a thing. And so I think, you know, I don't know because I'm not really there right now, but certainly the infant mortality situation in the United States, you know, is really it is a Black problem, not fully, but it is such a big problem, and it's so unfair that there is no way that what's going on right now cannot affect, you know, what a situation that was already unfair.
Yeah, the piece in the Times really made clear the role of the doula in that piece. It's so powerful. So another student asks, to just piggyback on that, do you have any advice for women of color when they go to doctors? Things that they might do to advocate for themselves, to step into situations of care or in the hospital where they have better guarantees for their own personal safety?
I get asked that a lot, and it really means a lot to me to, you know, because, you know, my daughter wasn't perfect, and it was hard because of the strange IUGR I had. So I think we all have, you know, I believe that this is a societal and a systemic problem. However, we are still individuals. This is not our fault, but it is our responsibility to care for each other. I am often the person in my family that it's like, you know, like I'm going with my mother anytime she's in the healthcare system. My eyes are peeled for anything they're not treating us right. And same, you know, you have to advocate for yourself. You also have to use all the resources you have. I have a friend who had metastatic breast cancer and she needed a mastectomy. We had a team of people that were right there. It was like somebody was sort of a healthcare provider of some sort. So they did the talking to the doctor. You know, somebody was cooking the food. Somebody was taking, you know, doing the driving, picking up and going. Somebody was at the bedside holding the hand. And so it's important that we, you know, we see the flaws in the system, but we also figure out how to work the system for us. Like me, whenever my daughter needed surgery. And so I did not, that doctor finally was so tired after he was dealt with me because I had read every single thing about him, his surgery, everything. He finally said, "Are you a doctor?" I said, "No, I'm just a mother who cares about my kid and nothing is going to happen to her here. And I'm not challenging you, but I am challenging you to convince me that you're the one who should care for her." And so other family members who were like, "Oh my God, you're going to mess it up for her." I was like, "No, I'm not. I don't care. I'm going to demand the care that I need, I deserve." And after I saw what happened to my father, all bets are off. So I'm going to make sure that I'm a good advocate, and that's what all of us should do. You may not be the one who should talk to the doctor. You may be the one that should hold the hand and bring the chicken soup and the herbal tea, but there's someone that can read up and be the one to say, "Wait a minute, this may not be the best thing that's happening, and I want you to just prove it to me." And that's okay. That's what we should be doing.
In some sense, we all need that, but in situations of disparate care, you know, Black women may need that even to a stronger extent or something like that. So let me, I'm really curious about the 3 buckets that you posed. I love that sort of analysis at the end. And so one of the students who read your articles, so I want to focus a little bit on the weathering concept. And one of the students wrote, "Who is supposed to be fighting to fix the injustice of medical discrimination? Black women are always fighting for everybody else. Are they expected to fight this fight as well?"
Mm. That's interesting question. And I, there is the reproductive justice movement in the United States is very, in the world really, in some parts of the world, is very an undertold story. So we think of reproductive rights as sort of like what's going on right now in the Supreme Court. But the reproductive justice movement is a Black-led movement. So reproductive justice is just the right to have a baby, not have a baby, to raise your child in a healthy environment. The reproductive justice movement is expansive. I strongly suggest, if you're interested in this topic, to look at the organization called Sister Song. It is the sort of the beginning of the first of the big reproductive justice movements. It's a Black-led movement. It was started by this wonderful woman named Loretta Ross, who when she was 13, I think she was 13, she got pregnant and had a terrible birth of her baby. She wanted to give up the baby. She ended up not giving it up. She ended up losing her fertility after that baby. And so she became this sort of scarred person who took her wounds and her pain and started this movement that is often not talked about, because you often hear about NARAL or Planned Parenthood or whatever, but there are these pockets of resistance around reproductive justice, Black-led, that are going to be interesting. So part of it is, we don't have to solve the world's problems and save ourselves. I hate that. I hate that we have to save ourselves. But also, what if we're the ones who have the knowledge? What if we're the ones who have the experience? What if we're the ones who know the stuff? And so we should be the ones who step up for the leadership. But certainly we should have people, an army of people behind us, so that we're not killing ourselves like we always have to do all the work. And I appreciate that question you ask, and I take that very seriously. I take the responsibility and also the exhaustion.
A question, how do you view your work differently since the Black Lives Matter movement, the student rights, with evolving conversations now about policing community care and the neglected value of Black lives?
That's interesting, because the last story, the refinery next door, I don't think you, maybe that wasn't on your reading list, but I saw this really wonderful resistance about an environmental justice resistance that was multiracial, and it was also multi-generational. And so I hate that George Floyd had to be murdered the way he was. I hate this, the Black people being killed by the police. I hate what's going on right now, but I also think that we want to grab onto this opportunity to keep doing our work. I am, it was funny because in March, I got early March, I went to this conference where we were doing this panel. We were on all these calls about how the panel was going to go. It was like, what should we call it? It's like race and reproduction and women's health. Okay. So somebody said, no, it should be about racism. And everybody was freaked out. It's like, oh, we can't say racism at this conference. Now everybody's saying racism. It's like, this is not about race and public health. It's about racism and public health. I am writing a book. It's completely late. I should be not even on this call. I should be down, chained to my desk, writing this book. But I have gone through and made it much stronger because I have been really encouraged by the racial justice movement, the Black Lives Matter movement that has happened. I mean, I am, as a journalist, I can't always we're not actually supposed to be involved in protests, but I'm always kind of there on the in the back or on the edge or behind my daughter and my son. But I think it's important for me personally, and thank you for asking, to be a little bit stronger and to go a little harder than I was before this happened. So I have been activated by what happened, and and I'm sad that it happened, but I'm glad that we can do something to make a difference.
So I'm going to ask one last question, and you finished your talk, which is on a note of hope. If you were in the room with all of our fabulous students, you would see such energy and such sort of a a natural inclination to try to impact and make change. And so this one student asks, and I think it's a good note to finish, what are the steps we as activists and young voices to combat the disparities in adequate medical care for marginalized groups? What can we do?
I think there's so many things you can do. Go on that group that I told you about, the it's at Berkeley. So the Institute, the Institute, whatever it is, in the student lounge, the Institute for Healing and Justice in Medicine, and read their manifesto. It's so good. And support that group. I mean, they're just people like you who are trying to make a difference, young people who are trying to make a difference. I think one of the most important things you can do is to tell other people about, the kinds of things you learned from me and from other people that have kind of awakened you. It's hard sometimes to talk to the older folks in your life, and sometimes they say, oh, you're the future of the country, you're the future of the world, but you are, but we are too. We shouldn't just leave you out to dry. You have to help us understand things. So my children are like, one of them's like your age, and you guys' age, one of them's a tiny bit older, my daughter. And so it was my mom's 90th birthday a few weeks ago. So we sat down with them and we said, explain abolition to us, okay? Because we don't like when you go on Instagram and Facebook, and they're not on Facebook, on Instagram, and you're talking, sort of criticizing some of the Democrats. And so explain this to us. So my mom's 90. She's like, I fought to vote. So it's only about voting. And so they sat us down and talked about how to think about what abolish something means and what abolition means and what reform means versus abolition. And it was so incredible. So it was the generations of my family talking about this. So now I can talk about it. So now my mother, who's 90, can talk about it, so that other people in the room, so that my children felt empowered to teach us something. So it's about, passing it on. And in my classes, I'm like, y'all are studying at home. I don't care who is watching my lecture. I cannot see you, exactly everyone in the room. So invite your family in, invite grandma in to hear my lecture about race in media, please. I like that. So I think it's important to, pass the word on. Don't think you don't matter. Just remember, those medical students didn't have any money and they started that institute. And I'm really inspired by that. And so, what you do matters, your energy matters, and your collective voice matters. And, your collaboration with older, different generations also matter.
Wonderful. So I know that you have your book to write, but I'm glad you took the time to be with us. I want to thank you for doing that. Thank you for your work. And we look forward to one day inviting you back live and in person, so you can feel and touch the energy in the room.
Thank you. I feel the energy, I'm like one of those people who gets inspired by energy. So I feel it, and I appreciate your having me here. Your questions are so smart, and I know you're all going to do great things in the world.
Great. Thank you. Good night.
Good night. Thank you.